Hi. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to tonight's conversation, Chicago Writers Against Trump, on what happened, what's happening, and what has to happen next. I'm Rachel Dewaskin, and when the National Writers Against Trump team asked us to assemble this Chicago post-election event, I thought immediately of our international writer friends, many who don't have the freedom to write what they want to write or write what they need to write, or be safely in political conversations, safely sometimes in artistic conversations. And so even though, and in some ways, because this is such a complicated and defining and difficult moment, I feel especially grateful to have been able to put together what Zayd and I consider to be a dream team of Chicago writers tonight to have this conversation. I just want to mention that after our Chicago conversation at 7 o'clock Chicago time, there's a national Writers Against Trump conversation with Salman Rushdie and Natasha Trethewey and Paul Auster and others. So I hope everybody will be able to go from this event to that event. And the first writer I'll introduce you to tonight is Zayd Dorn, my partner of 20 years, my co-host tonight, a screenwriter, a playwright, and the chair of the radio, TV, and film department at Northwestern.
Thanks, and thank you all for being here. It's great to see everybody. Obviously, we didn't know when we set up this event what was going to be happening at this very moment. So we chose, the 2 days after the election. We thought we would have enough to understand something of what was happening, but also still be in the moment and trying to figure out what's going to come. Obviously, we still don't know exactly what's going to happen. I think we have a good idea that, that the election is going to go our way, but maybe it'll be called while we're on the air right now. What we also know, and I think is important to think about, is we know that that it was very close, and that means we have to reckon with what that means for us and for our country. So I'm really glad that we get to have this conversation with these writers right now, because I think it's an important conversation to have. I'm going to introduce a few people and then we'll get started. It's going to be quick bios. First of all, I want to introduce my partner, Rachel Dewoskin, who is a novelist and a poet and a nonfiction writer and a professor of creative writing at University of Chicago. I want to introduce two of my colleagues, Thomas Bradshaw, who's a playwright, a screenwriter, a television writer, and a professor at Northwestern, and Özge Samanci, who's a graphic novelist, a writer, an interactive media practitioner, and an all-around brilliant person.
We also have with us the irreverent erudite poets and UChicago profs of poetry, Suzanne Buffam and Srikanth Reddy, and the brilliant, inimitable novelist, essayist, short story writer, and UChicago professor, Mitchell Jackson. So that is our Chicago team. Thank you guys so much for having this conversation and being in this surreal room with us and in this incredibly complicated moment with us. What happened? What's happening? Chiku and Suzanne, what has to happen?
Well, maybe to ease into that question, I'll just begin by saying the reason Suzanne and I are in the same room is because we're also a couple, and we're from Chicago. Or we live in Chicago, but we're actually beaming to you from British Columbia, from Victoria, British Columbia, where we're spending the year, not in a black box theater. It's a rental apartment with black drapes. But I think by way of thinking about what's happening, when we signed up, when we all signed up for this conversation, we were anticipating that it would be more of a what happened, past tense discussion of something that was behind us, and the fact that it's still happening means that we're not out of the the Trump event yet, and I think that's probably something that we're going to be metabolizing and learning to live with and learning to incorporate into our lives for a long time to come. Just the fact that this election isn't yet over 2 days after after it ordinarily would have been ended means that kind of like closure, which is a literary concern of every writer on a formal level, is something that's become a kind of living and kind of receding kind of question for like all of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I would add that even if it had been over insofar as we knew the outcome, it still would never have been, not, it's a long way from over. And I do feel like the kind of moral failure that the closeness of this race is an index of is, a sign of, I guess I've been hoping for a larger repudiation of the moral atrocities of the prior, let's hope, administration. But that's going to, I think, continue to, be at the crux of the future is the closeness of that. I can't believe how close it is.
Yeah. Well, I went to bed on, I was so depressed on Tuesday night when I went to bed because, the margins and, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, had Biden so far behind. I mean, I knew intellectually that all these other votes had to be counted, but it seemed very much a repeat of what happened in 2016. I mean, the map looked the exact same, and so I was very hopeful, when I woke up the next day. But like to your point, it's very disappointing that that the election is close. And what I find to be profoundly disturbing at this moment is just all the efforts, the lawsuits to try to stop the vote count. I mean, maybe I guess 20 minutes before we got on this, Trump just filed a federal emergency injunction, to try to stop the vote count in Philadelphia. And it seems laughable, but it makes me a little anxious that he might succeed in one of these frivolous lawsuits and actually be able to stop the count. I was, watching CNN last night. So I was like, why is he filing all these lawsuits that are so clearly ridiculous? And this one Republican lawyer said that the goal is to, slow the countdown, slow things down so that they can't certify the vote. If you can't certify the vote by December 14th or whatever, then it decides the election. So it's a very, it's a very dark motivation,
Mm. Yeah. I'm curious. I mean, Suzanne talked about, the kind of what it means for our country that it was so close. And I'm curious for all of you, what you feel like you've learned as citizens or writers from this. I mean, I know we all hoped for repudiation. I'm not sure if all of you, thought that was going to happen. I don't know how much optimism there was in this group, but I am curious what you feel now about this country and about what this all meant.
Suzanne said she thought we were going to get a repudiation, and I was thinking what we got was a confirmation of what we have here. And I think one thing that seems different, I guess, maybe since probably prior to the civil rights movement, is like, to me, all of the legitimate reasons other than white supremacy for voting for Trump have been removed. Like, the economy is failing, there's COVID, we know that he's a misogynist, we know that he doesn't care about the military, like all the other reasons that other racists would kind of use as a shield for their racism have been removed. So it's like he's like a bald-faced racist. Yeah. And 45% of the country said he's our guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think another part of it.
For me, I'm hoping that there would be an outcome that we can relax and move on with our lives. But regardless of Biden or Trump wins the election, there is no such outcome. Even if Biden wins the election, right, it means that we all have to work even harder because what we are seeing here is there are huge problems, and there is no way of winning. Actually, whoever wins, there is work that needs to be done.
Do you guys remember the line in the Heather McHugh poem? I can't remember the name of the poem, but it's in her book Hinge and Sign, and the line is, it's about a tornado that devastates a town, and the final couplet is something like, first it was over and then it was never over.
Yes. Yes.
It really gives me
Yeah.
that feeling. It calls that line to my mind.
Yeah.
Well, so I think there's two ways, just from a writerly perspective, that this kind of fraught, kind of unstable moment brings to mind. One is, and they both have to do with narrative and narratives, right? A friend of mine said, before the election night, said, have you thought through what your life will be like and what you will do if things go the way that you want them to go, and if they go the other way? And I had a pretty clear fantasy narrative of what my life would be like if things were decided in a landslide on Tuesday, but I couldn't even bring myself to imagine a narrative of what my role as a protagonist in a narrative would be if things went sideways really badly. And so I think there's one question is like, we thought a narrative would end and a new one would begin, and we don't really know where we are in that storyline. But also there's just this, like, one of the things that Trump has been doing with this proliferation of cases, of legal cases, is kind of multiply. It's a classic strategy of multiplying false narratives, right?
Yeah.
And that's not ending with his administration. That's going to continue with QAnon and any number of conspiratorial master narratives that aren't going to go away, right? And so then, as writers, how do we assimilate those narratives or construct counter narratives? That's the challenge, I think.
Yeah, I have been curious about, as writers, I agree, Chico, about the idea of imagining what we're doing as protagonists. And as writers, I'm sure most of us think of our whatever utility we have as being in writing. And so I did spend some time before the election thinking, what could I and should I write if it goes well, and what could I and should I write if it goes badly? And of course, here we are, and it's sort of up for grabs, and it clearly is not either one in a way. But how do we? What use are we in terms of diagnosing? I've been thinking a lot about people like Arthur Miller writing The Crucible during McCarthyism, or James Baldwin writing The Fire Next Time. Like, these are things that not only diagnose and call to action, but also, even after the thing is gone, even after McCarthyism is gone, The Crucible still speaks to what we go through, because those things never, it was over and then it was never over, right? Trumpism, fascism is not going to be over, not now, and not for a long time. White supremacy certainly is not going to be over. So how do we address that? Even if Biden wins in the next few days, how do we address that in a way that makes sense in the future?
Well, it's a really interesting question that you ask. And I guess my question is, how do we reach people beyond our silos? You know what I mean? Like, we can all write about how destructive white supremacy, fascism, and and the forces that have been unleashed in our country are. We can write about these things, but I think we're mostly writing to, at this point in time, we're only reaching people who are in our silo. So, we write the things that we write, and everybody in our, people in our silos, see what we've written and they agree, but we're not really changing the minds of people that we would like to change the minds of,
You mean Trump isn't watching this right now?
He's shouting at the screen, right? He's shouting at the screen.
Yeah. Two things he really likes are writers and people who are against Trump. So, yeah.
I feel like one way to fight with this is one-to-one interaction. So when I look at those red states and I click on the map and zoom in to that state, And I see some blue parts in that state. And those are the parts where the universities are, where like some kind of hope is happening. So it's almost like blood is not going some parts of the country. And I feel like in the ideal world, I should be interacting with people, doing workshops, teaching something, talking to people in those really red areas. But of course, it's almost a fantasy. How do I really do that?
Yeah, I wonder too. I'm mad at the rappers. I think we should all go to some rap concerts and hold up some placards like, are you serious? Yeah, but one of the things that really upset me was the number of percentage of Black men who voted in for him. And I was trying to like wrap my mind around it. And I think if we think about the work that we can do in terms of changing narratives, I feel like it does have to be people that are in our inner circle, because ultimately racism is not logical. So we can't, like, how are we going to go to a racist and try to present them with a logical argument? But I do think, say, I could talk to 2 or 3 of my friends who happen to say, let's just keep an open mind about Ice Cube or 50 Cent or somebody and have a dialogue with them. When you go into the prisons, a lot of times they talk about this concept of a credible messenger, and that the guys respect you more because they feel like you guys have some kind of experience in common. And I think that's really where we're like really trying to find people who are on the fringes and hopefully do a little bit more converting. But the other thing is like, well, then how do you deal with those other people who got the, I was thinking like, what's going to happen when the MAGA hats are over? Like when that's not paraphernalia that they're wearing anymore, and you can't so easily discern who is who, but they still hold the same kind of ideologies. Like, I think some people are going to be in trouble with those kind of interactions, not to be a pessimist about things.
Well, I think of what you said earlier about the stripping away of the kind of layers of justifications around why you might have voted for him. And it seems to me they've distilled into 2 categories. One is just blatant racism that people don't even deny in themselves. And then the second one, or maybe a better way to describe it, is to say that the one sort of remaining flimsy excuse is a financial excuse. The idea being that you support this regime because you don't want your taxes to be raised, or because, in a way, justice for people who are in positions of certain privilege, equality and justice feel like a tremendous demotion.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me one of the questions is about how to get a feeling of humanity that's adequate to the task of inspiring some people to make sacrifices of their own privilege toward having a quality that would benefit all of us in the long term. I don't know if our collective poems and plays are quite up to the task. I mean, rap is maybe a better vehicle for conveying what's fundamentally human decency, humanity, empathy, caring about someone else's experience in the world.
So another way of thinking about what Mitchell was saying about, reaching out to different kinds of communities, the rap community and incarcerated populations, is also to think about, not trying to convince people who are already convinced of what their narrative is, of what the narrative is, but rather to kind of produce new kind of reading publics, by writing for children, people whose minds haven't been made up about these questions. And that's another way to.
Yeah.
And by teaching and by being in conversation with students and people we meet all over the place. There's an interesting question in the chat here. Somebody asks, are racism and fear the same thing? How do we think about these, especially if we're trying to reach people?
I don't think they are the same thing, but I think you can't have racism without a component of fear, because it's like a motivator for trying to convince people of a certain ideology. But, you know, I'm scared of needles, and I don't consider myself to be a racist.
Yeah.
The other thing I've been wondering about, and I'm curious, especially, you know, many of you have international backgrounds, and maybe Özge, this is something you could speak to. You know, I mean, I agree completely with Mitchell that in America, the primary, you know, motivator of Trumpism is clearly white supremacy and racism, and that has been stripped bare. But I keep on thinking about the fact that we're not experiencing this in isolation, that Trumpism also is part of a wave of right-wing fascism and xenophobia and authoritarianism around the world, right? So it makes sense that in America, the manifestation would be white supremacy, but we see it in other places. So, I mean, I wonder what we do with that. I mean, to me, that's just as scary as what we just saw in the election, that it's not something where you put this genie back in the bottle and, you know, Europe is fine and Asia is fine and Africa is fine. I mean, in fact, we see a real, like, global trend in these directions. So I don't know what we do with that.
Well, probably using the term is a good start, right? I mean, I feel like we're talking about white supremacy in a different way than we did a few years ago when it was, you know, I don't know how many years ago, when people were individual white supremacists, you know, but I think now what's being laid bare is the structural, you know, white supremacy that is operating certainly nationally, but also on this global scale. That's just to reiterate that, yes, and that it's interesting to see how the terms get regenerated.
I think that's such a good point. And in a funny way, I feel like it's maybe our first answer in some way to our earlier question about what to do as writers. I mean, it's almost facile even to say it, but we have to name the things. Yeah. And the ways in which words have kind of lost their meanings and are sort of floating away in the just avalanche of lies and destruction of language is something to which writers can kind of, I don't know, we can pay attention and we can try to repair some of the damage by using the language. Frankly, I mean, it reminds me of Berlin. Zayd and I went to Berlin on various research trip, and one of the things that we noticed that was such a standout quality of all of the art there and all of the memorials was the absolute refusal to avert collective eyes from the worst atrocities committed by. So, like in the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, the word "murdered" just appeared relentlessly on every plaque, every letter, every postcard, every description. They never euphemize.
They never say people died here. They never say, you know, the victim. They always say the murdered Jews, which really puts it on them.
And actually, now that we're saying it, it's true in the new Civil Rights Museum too in Jackson, which we took the kids to a year ago. And I feel like we were really struck by how America doesn't do that. We don't admit the thing. We don't say the words. We don't use the language. And so maybe that's part of what happens next. An absolute refusal to avert our eyes.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, on one hand, obviously, language is really important. I mean, but you know, I've been reading all sorts of, Trump supporters being asked, you know, like, well, you know, aren't you a racist for, you know, supporting Trump? And they're like, well, I watch Major League Baseball and I watch basketball, and you know, like, I'm clearly not a racist. Because, you know, black guys, you know, hate these sports, so like using the language, they're not going to hear that language and think that's me, you know. Especially like saying they can just point to the rappers that are supporting Trump. Hey, look, you know, you know, so and so is, you know, supporting Trump. It makes me not a racist. But you know, when you make about language, though, it's you know. I can't help but thinking that we've been duped a little by language, in the sense that, you know, prior to Trump, it was not acceptable to go around openly being a racist. So, and because of that, people like you, they couldn't say certain things. So they did say certain things, and it was like, oh, wait a minute, you know, the world is getting better, progress is being made because these things are being said. But we have convinced people to say things, but they weren't saying the right thing. Yeah. So then Trump comes out And he's like, hey, we can be racist, we can be xenophobic, you know, we can be sexist. And so these people are like, oh, finally, I could say what's on my mind. So, you know, and I think, you know, like so many liberals were shocked, you know, by his election, because they had been listening to people saying the right things for so long, but we hadn't changed our hearts in any way. So I think it's an interesting.
I think if there's a positive from his 4 years in office, that might be it. That he has attacked, you know, language, the press in such a way that everyone feels like caretakers of the language and of a certain, you know, their vision of the truth. So, you know, maybe we have him to thank for that. And I was also thinking about that. I think it's a Frost essay where he was talking about being at home in the metaphor, and basically like, if you're not at home in the metaphor, you can't really exist in the world. And I was thinking about how, you know, people in the humanities can decipher all these dog whistles, you know, the law and order and all of this other language that might be harder for someone else to determine. And what Özge was saying about, you know, the universities are where the kind of bright spots are, where people are able to kind of, you know, kind of shuck off some of this racist rhetoric. I think that that's a part of it too, is like really understanding what symbolism is, what metaphor is, what the history of a language is, what the etymology of whatever given word is, so that you can really understand what they're saying when they say, you know, stand down and stand by, or, you know, I feel like he has given us that, where we're all peaked for that kind of rhetoric, whereas, you know, previous presidents weren't so flagrant in a way that we had to decipher it in that way.
You know, sorry.
Oh, I just, all the talking about the way language is being used as political speech makes me think of the Orwell essay, Politics in the English Language, you know, which was written in 1946 and really addresses the way that people act like language is this sort of natural outgrowth, but actually is a tool that people use to, you know, shape their purposes.
I think, I mean, and the date of publication of that essay kind of relates to what you were asking Zayd earlier about, you know, transnational kind of resistance to, you know, fascism. And I'd be curious to hear what your perception of that is, Özge, you know, in the international kind of perspective.
I came to the United States 17 years ago, and the year I came, Erdogan's government started, and he's still the president. And so, like, when the time for, he was a prime minister, when the time for prime minister duration was over, he created a position for presidency, and he managed to stay in that time. And like those dynamics that you're describing, I cannot talk for every country, but there are similar hierarchies. If it's not white supremacy, in Turkish context, it's Turkish-Kurdish division. So those, I mean, those dynamics in different names with different, they are not same things. They existed and they operate on that. But what like Trump, what Erdogan is achieving, what Putin is achieving, I think it's applicable to any society.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Almost the dynamics are archaic, like the.
I just was gonna. I think that's exactly right, and I've been curious about why now. You know, I mean, I think for a long time, 4, 6, 8 years ago, people talked about, you know, the Syrian refugees and the way that wave of immigration seemed to trigger a backlash in Europe. And I don't know what the equivalent thing is now here, you know, maybe Obama's presidency or some sense of a threat to white supremacy, a threat to traditional American, whatever people felt, right? But it does strike me. I mean, you guys are talking about the the moment Orwell is writing about, right, where he's confronting fascism and authoritarianism in the Soviet Union and all these things. And here we are trying to diagnose it, and maybe 40 years from now it'll be clear looking back why this was happening, or why at this moment we were seeing a wave in countries that seemingly don't have the same political dynamics at work.
Yeah.
It's hard to put a finger on, but
Yeah.
of course, capitalism is a rolling ball, and that 1% is becoming more powerful, and that is impacts of it is coming to a critical point. Like, one of the motives is definitely that.
Özge, can I ask you about graphics in this moment? And
Sure.
in general, I mean, we talked about language, right? And I think we talked about polite talk, euphemism, and the way we used to say things that covered the things that were actually happening under the surface, and how maybe this horrendous moment has risen some of the reality to the surface, even as the administration has tried to obfuscate it. But what about drawing? What about the graphic work that you do? Is there a distinction to be made? Like, what about drawers against Trump and graphic novelists against Trump? Like, what are you making in this moment?
So I think like the comics people and graphic novels people, they will continue to produce, like the COVID era, maybe even give some of them the opportunity of stay at home and do their work more. I see like increasing productivity on that. I'm creating a piece right now on more environmental issues and more friendship. It's never like directly to the current political climate, but while doing that, at the background, I think myself as not a like political activist, but then I'm feeling that I don't have that luxury anymore. Like, no one has the luxury of not being politically active. So that I am feeling that.
Well, writing about the environment for kids seems like a kind of activism that, you know, I got cut off when I was trying to answer your question, Zayd, about why now and what's threatening, you know, the white levers of power. And around the world, it seems like one of the things is climate collapse is really an imminent threat. So when you say in 40 years, we'll look back clearly, it'll be through smoke or a wave, you know. So I think there is a global threat, and those who have the levers of power are clutching them really hard, you know. And I mean, I think that's part of that.
Yeah, and also,
Yes, like capitalism and environmental crisis goes hand to hand. Yeah.
there's a interesting moment we're at now where like anti-Black racism in the U.S. is being responded to globally by, you know, protests. There was a maybe a little bit underreported story about the kind of explosion of protests against the George Floyd murder in places like India, right? Small, outbreaks of activism, but meaningful ones in Nairobi and Beirut and around the world. And that's one way that the world is listening to what's happening here and starting to think more relationally about racism in the US, white supremacism in the US, and other forms of kind of authoritarianism and tyranny. Right?
I want to ask a question. What do you all think is the role of Twitter in the preservation of language, the preservation of truth? I mean, I know they're putting little stamps on people's tweets now and saying, but I wonder, I'm not that versed in Twitter, but like if I start tweeting xenophobic or racist or just untrue facts, would they cut off my account, or would I just be able to keep on doing it? And what is the relationship between free speech and the ability on Twitter to say whatever you want to say?
Well, if you in particular were to start tweeting, I think Twitter would have a real problem on their hands.
Yes. I'd be jobless.
I don't know. I don't use social media.
Yeah, I'm not on Twitter at all, but it is interesting that they have begun to, as you say, make a note of things the president is, I mean, I know so little, but they're flagging as questionable truths, I guess. What's the language they use to flag his falsehoods, lies?
Lately, they've been putting flags on it that say things like, this is not a verified, statement of fact about an election. This is disputed. See here for more information, stuff like that. But I mean, I think to Mitchell's question, I'm not on any social media either, but I do, I think it's obviously had a profound effect on our society, and it is a way in which language gets, viralized, becomes a sort of disease in the body politic. And I also think they haven't, I mean, to go to Özge's point about capitalism, it's very clear that Facebook and Twitter and all these places have come up with a business model that allows free speech to be a way of saying, we have no responsibility for anything we do. We will put everything out there, and if it has a destructive impact on society, that's something other people should clean up. And they've made that a wildly profitable business model. And one of the things that's wild, and I think it goes to your question, Mitchell, is they have the resources to monitor President Trump's tweets. They can have staffers 24/7 looking at his stuff, but they couldn't do that for you or for everybody because they've got billions of users. And their business model is not profitable if they actually tried to, operate as publishers, if they actually tried to take responsibility for what's going on.
There's an interesting kind of Chinese template for the answer to this question too, and it relates to our conversation about language and making language and saying the things. So in China, the social media has always been ruled with an iron fist, and there are many words that are just unacceptable, which you cannot use, and as soon as you use those words, they immediately shut your account down. And Chinese netizens, being acrobatic and linguistic, and I think brilliant, come up with new language immediately. And that new language is instantly shared and understood by all the people on social media. It's kind of like a cat and mouse game with the censors. So for example, Ai Weiwei, the controversial Chinese artist, his name is banned from Weibo, which is Chinese Twitter. And so immediately when that happened, Chinese netizens created this slogan, Ai Wei Lai, which means I love the future. It's cheerful and patriotic and hard to argue with. And then they just used that in place of Ai Weiwei's name. And I sometimes wonder about the English language and the Orwell essay and kind of our reputation abroad. I wonder what language we might create to tell the truth, actually, to keep using the language that describes what's in fact happening here and what we see underneath all the euphemism.
But the United States is still much ahead of China and Turkey and maybe even Russia in terms of free speech. I don't think like any of you have the concern of saying something wrong on this broadcast, but I'm constantly telling myself, be careful what you are saying, be careful what you are saying, because of the government in Turkey, right? That when the pressure increases that much, I'm sure any society would come up with creative solutions. I'm sure, like, as free speech disappears, that wicked creativity will take over.
Well, in a way, we're also seeing a backlash right now in our language when you think about this kind of dog whistle language that it seems like the white supremacists in our culture have come up with. Gestures, things. I don't know the language of it, but I've heard, there are things you can do with your hands in a photograph that telegraphs something, and of course, language as well used as dog whistle. But we're also seeing now almost the falling away of that as it becomes more and more okay to be openly, horrifically racist in open ways. So yeah, it seems like there's a backlash against what people thought of as politically correct speech. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you know, I mean, it's almost. I mean, we've been having this conversation for the last few years, but it's almost like we are living in at least two different countries. You know what I mean? We talk about our country like we're living in the same country, but we're clearly living in. I think the Atlantic did an article which basically said we're living in 13 different. You know, and like talk about education and like Harpers, etc. But anyway, like we're kind of like talking about one country, and we're talking about literature and essays by Orwell and like how do we get that information? You know what I mean? Like there are still places in this country, like if you grow up in parts of the South, you see the Confederate flag every day. You know, your neighbors have the Confederate flag up. You know, it's still flying from some state houses. There's still some, you know, and this affects how history is taught in these places. There's some places where they're really referring to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. You know what I mean? So, like education, seems to be a big factor here. You know, when we talk about because there are millions of children who are being indoctrinated into a white supremacist, mindset. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, education, seems like a really important part of cultivating readers, right? I mean, writers are somewhat powerless if there are no readers.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we're seeing also with the kind of conspiratorial and kind of fantastic or fantasy narratives that are so hard to stamp out is kind of a scary efflorescence of kind of close reading. There's enormously resourceful close readings of hand gestures in photographs or, piecing together outlandish narratives from various pieces of information or data. And so I think, we're kind of talking about two almost irreconcilable things where we're trying to talk about how do we reduce the number of false narratives while also, maintaining kind of freedom of speech in a kind of increasingly authoritarian media culture. And the flip side of those questions is how do we teach people to read, right? To read sensibly. And so that's, I think, is the education question that you're asking, you're mentioning, Thomas.
And some part of that education is interaction with people who are different than you. Like I remember one time I got trapped, like I didn't have a ride in a Athens, Ohio airport. It's just there's no way of transportation. I was hopeless. So I walked to this group of local people, mostly old folks, like white folks, and I asked a woman, may I ride in your bus to Athens? We were in Columbus airport. She fearfully looked at me. I have an accent from another country. She doesn't know me. She's going to take me into bus. She took the courage, took me into bus, and we started a conversation with these old folks. And apparently they have never met with an international folk. They opened up during the journey, and even those kind of interactions could change people. We are living in our bubbles, and this segregation is happening in the country. And maybe when the sea levels rise, all these blue sides are gonna move to the middle, and it's gonna all mess up. That might be a good outcome of the global environmental crisis.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think the only divide that seems as salient as the racial divide in this election is the rural-urban divide, right? And the idea that it seems like vast areas of the country that don't have as much diversity of any kind, racial, cultural, any kind of diversity, see the world in a very different way. And it seems like people in cities somehow, even white folks in cities, there's enough of some kind of interaction happening that people are able to see a broader kind of culture that's possible, or imagine an America that looks different, and they're okay with that, or many of them seem to be.
And Özge, I totally agree. I think familiarity is just a huge key. And I think, again, I go back to Sino-US relations just because I've spent so much time in China, so much of my life in that conversation. But the unfamiliarity is fear. I mean, we talked earlier about whether Mitchell's fear of needles makes him a racist. Like, you know, we hate things that we can't understand. Again, there's a Marianne Moore line about that, right? The things we can't understand make us fearful and uncomfortable. And I think like all of the ideas I've heard about China that are so inaccurate and so bizarre can be unpacked instantaneously upon befriending someone who is Chinese and lives in China. And so I felt through my whole 20s and 30s, like the main goal was to introduce everybody to each other all the time. And I think this is why in cities, like the density leads to familiarity. And just having seen and lived next to people who aren't identical to you makes you appreciate the possibility that those people also need healthcare and love their kids.
But that's actually a really good question for all of you, that like, because as writers, I think a lot of what we think about and talk about is empathy, and how literary empathy kind of can theoretically create a connection between people, or like an insight into people who are unlike you. But I think a lot of writers in the last few years who I've talked to have become increasingly like distrustful of empathy as a device, that it seems to somehow be a way of making people feel better about themselves without actually having to challenge their own beliefs. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wonder how you all in your own work think about empathy and think about, showing people what difference looks like, and is that a worthwhile goal for us?
I'll just say a quick answer, which is that in some ways I kind of feel like the big problem right now isn't so much empathy, although it's been being discussed a lot now, so much as just the ability to discern what truth is. Mm-hmm. Right? And that people's confusion about what is actually true is the more pressing problem, because that's what people vote on and act on in the world. So, an example from the China context would be like the whole question about Huawei and the Trump administration's response to 5G, in the US and elsewhere. And I sat in on a class in an Asian studies department where their view of the whole debate was very different from what both in the US, the Trump side, and liberals who were concerned about the security of the 5G network were. And it was just very hard for me to know what the truth, narrative was, right? But I don't mean to kind of, sidetrack the empathy question, but I think that and maybe they're two sides of the same question. But.
I think they are, actually. I think being able to acknowledge and imagine someone else's perspective as having validity and having a kind of like a three-dimensional kaleidoscopic quality to it allows us to humanize other people and to understand that what we think is true may be viewed very differently by someone else. And let me just, I'm not a moral relativist. Like, I think some people are wrong, and Trump is one of them, and some people are war criminals, so I'm not saying that it's like that perspective and this perspective get equal weight or something. But I do think that reading is a way of coming into contact with people whose truths are different from yours, but still matter. And widening the kind of elasticity of your own margins, the ways that you can see the world through the perspectives of other people.
Well, the question about empathy is really fascinating, because obviously, if you can really get people to empathize, then that's such a powerful tool, right? But, there's a lot of work, that I guess isn't really meant to get people to empathize. It's more meant to teach. You know what I mean? and sometimes that work has kind of like a voyeuristic type quality. So it's like, oh, look, I see this play with Black people in it. I feel like I'm learning something about Black culture. And, it's like, oh, that's how those people do it. That's what their life is like. But they don't think, oh, that's just like my family. That's me also. It's like there's still this separation between us and them. So I think, more work that inspires empathy and less work that is so, didactically trying.
Yeah, well, and I think also more work that complicates, whether it's a character or a narrator. Maybe I think literature is a place where you can be unsure and explore complexity and not just teach or better people, but to interrogate the self. I think I trust a writer who's hard on themselves a lot more than I trust a writer who's morally righteous and, beacon of good in a way. I think there's something important to be done on that level at this moment for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think the danger of empathy is it's like we need to accept the differences. So if we try to operate, oh, this is like me, so I'm gonna like it and I'm gonna care about it, then how we are going to be different? That part gets tricky, but it's a very powerful tool to really make a quick change. And I rely on empathy, and when I write, create, I aim empathy. But I think the argument for people who are hesitating for empathy is that.
Yeah. Tony Kushner says a thing I've always found really interesting about empathy in theater, where he says, in every time an artist creates tries to make a connection to an audience member, every time you're asked to empathize as an audience member with a character, you're asking a thing that is impossible for the kind of the audience member and the character to become one, for a connection that is actually never going to work. But he says, so each time you make that leap, you miss, but there's something miraculous about the attempt to make that leap, and it's worth trying it, even though you will never totally, find that unity with another person. Just the attempt to try to kind of like almost get them, almost understand them, is sort of the whole goal of art.
Yeah. We've been talking about, or back a few minutes ago, we were talking about education, and I was thinking about all the writers that we've mentioned, how we kind of group them into kind of liberal thinkers and visionaries. And then I was thinking about how one of my favorite writers probably 10 years ago was Barry Hannah. And I read Hannah and I loved his language, and that's really all I was looking for, was the language. I think he writes beautiful sentences. And then I reread Hannah, having assigned it for a craft lecture, and I was appalled at the bare racism of his work. And I knew that he was writing about, and this is Airship, so he was writing about the 1950s and 60s in Mississippi. And I was like, but of course he was racist. But I was also thinking that there are some English departments, I'm sure in Mississippi or Alabama, elsewhere, Tennessee, where all they're reading is Barry Hannah. And so this idea that education is going to save us might not be the thing, because you could be indoctrinated into a whole other kind of paradigm. So I don't know what that means.
No.
Educators, but we got to make sure our reading lists are right.
But that's the interesting thing. I mean, it's how are we educating people? It's not. It's education is not the answer. It's like, but it's so like that's the problem. It's like, what are we? How are we educating people? Like, what are we teaching them about history? What literature are we deciding is valuable for them to read? I mean, this is like you've gotten exactly to the heart of the matter. These kids are being educated. It's just not, I guess, the way that I think it's appropriate to educate people.
And to really,
but people say the same thing about my method of education. So here we have the two country thing again, in a way.
One way to bring that around to the question of governance, that brings us together is not only how we're educating people, but who's educating people. We have a Secretary of Education whose brother is the head of a mercenary, international corporation, literally mercenary. And I think that's one thing we can look forward to after Trump is making some fundamental changes at the top of these questions.
Well,
Thomas Bradshaw for Secretary of Education.
I think all how many of us? All 7 of us are professors, and watching how Trumpism has kind of filtered down to the university, even to liberal, urban universities like ours. Been kind of amazing. I mean, Betsy DeVos and this new executive order banning critical race theory as though that's something they can do, or kind of banning immigrant students. And you realize how much the university has been this kind of this place where people could imagine a certain international, cosmopolitan, diverse community, but it's fairly imaginary, or it's fairly isolated in America. And when you get a government that wants to attack it, it's pretty easy to attack it. It's pretty easy to limit that kind of community.
And the freedom I opened with, and then Özge kind of echoed later, the freedom that we have, the 7 of us, to be having this conversation in public and saying the words we think are important and asking the questions we want asked. I feel like that's actually fragile.
Yeah.
I don't feel a sense of eternal entitlement to that. And I don't know if America will continue to provide that.
Oh, we've got 2 minutes. Somebody say something hopeful.
Yeah.
Okay. I like when we think of this education issue with the prison complex, it gains another level. We're talking about what kind of lens we are going to use in the education, but in the prison issue, there is not even education. It's just putting people in a systemic way. And there, any kind of education would work almost, I'm going to say. Any kind of exposition to literature or science is going to work.
I feel we've solved the problems.
There's so many directions to go at this point, and
20
Now we just have to find a cure for COVID. Minutes left.
And then we can do this in person here.
I think as soon as we cut off, we are going to open a browser and check the election results.
Right.
I know. I'm still holding on to hope, and not just of the kind of short-term electoral sort, of the seismic change sort. And I have found the Black Lives Matter protesters and that movement and the normalization of that slogan even in America to be heartening. I do feel like movements are being built. And to go back to Kushner, when Zayd had a conversation with Kushner in Chicago a couple of years ago, he said, we all have to be writers and we also have to be citizens. And he meant it in a totally unpretentious and practical way. He was like, get up in the morning and write your novel, write your essay, make your graphic novel, write your poems, write your play. And then in the afternoon, you phone bank. In the afternoon, you go door to door. In the afternoon, you do these kinds of conversations.
You march. Yeah.
You march. You show up at the protests. You support the kids who are putting together the most progressive and radical activist oppositions.
Yeah, I would agree with you. The Black Lives Matter movement, I found it to be so hopeful and inspiring, and such a counterweight against white supremacy and Trumpism. So I think there's lots of cause for hope, especially just the way people were just coming out in droves. It was really there are a lot of good people out there. So.
That's a beautiful note on which to end.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. Let's go and check the electoral maps.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Okay.